Now, if we compare those with reserves of oil, gas, and coal, which are on the left, we see that those reserves, those are discovered reserves that are extractable with current economics and technology. They considerably exceed what we can afford to burn. This tells us that there's an issue there. We in Oil Change International did a little update of this last year in a report called The Sky's Limit, why the Paris climate goals require a managed decline of fossil fuel extraction. And in that we looked not at all of the reserves, but just at the reserves in oil fields, gas fields, and coal mines that are already producing, where everything's been built, where the pipelines are in place, the wells have been drilled, and so on. And so on a different scale, here's that chart looking just at what's been developed. Now, what that says to us is that the oil, gas, and coal, just in existing fields and mines, would be enough to take the world past 2 degrees. That means we have an issue, a climate issue for all new development of fossil fuel extraction. Now, there's been increasing discussion within policy circles, among experts, among academics, and within NGOs of addressing this question of the supply of fossil fuels as part of a package of measures to deal with climate change. There are a number of policies that have been proposed for how we can constrain fossil fuel supply to stay within climate limits. For example, moratoria, quotas, export taxes, and so on. And in today's call, we're going to talk about one specific type of policy which can help constrain fossil fuel extraction to closer to climate limits, and that is the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. So I'm really happy to hand over to Ivieta now to take us through the findings of her new study.
Thank you very much, Greg, for the excellent introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. I'm presenting this research on behalf of a team, and I'm very happy that that has been a very good teamwork, and some of the co-authors are today on the call. And we're also very grateful to our peer reviewers, some of whom are also today on the call and will be providing their views later throughout the webinar. And thank you, Greg, because you are also one of them. You have already spoken about zombie energy and what this term means. It's pretty straightforward. We're talking about fossil fuel that are only able to be produced as a result of government support. And we have drawn on the ongoing discussion now in the financial community around zombie banks, zombie companies, and also on the conversation in China about slashing overcapacity and zombie companies in the coal sector there. Once we define zombie companies, the question is about subsidies. And here there are different definitions. Some of you may have heard different numbers for quantification of fossil fuel subsidies on both production and consumption side. And in this respect, it's important to stress that we have only used the 70 billion estimate from the last year's report from OCI and ODI, empty promises. And at the same time, of course, there are other forms of support through public finance, through state-owned enterprises. And the next slide The next slide is showing these layers of definitions. that exist for both production and consumption subsidies. So in our research, we looked at the most straightforward forms of subsidies that are consistent with the WTO definition of subsidies, including, first of all, of course, direct transfer of funds. For instance, for exploration, we looked at tax breaks, such as accelerated depreciation or relief on royalties, and some regulatory loopholes, for example, caps on liability for oil spills. Of course, if you get large numbers in terms of subsidy estimates, most likely they also include the cost of externalities. We haven't included those in our analysis because we chose to have the most defendable analysis at this stage and most defendable definition. We have looked those through the production cycle, and we see that all stages of exploration, gaining access to field development, and then extraction and transportation and decommissioning, all these stages are subsidized. We haven't included in our analysis the electricity sector for methodological reasons, but otherwise we tried to be comprehensive. And the result that we get from the simulations that are run with the systems analysis, system dynamics model, provide us with a pretty conservative answer, which is a global removal of production subsidies over 2017-2050 will save around 37 gigaton of emissions, or this is equivalent to 1.1 gigaton per year. I have to say, though, that there is, of course, a lot of sensitivity regarding the assumptions in the scenarios, and we use the IEA current policy scenario, which takes the energy prices quite high up towards 2050. And at the same time, we know that the lower the energy prices in the assumptions and in simulations, the more emissions are avoided as a result of production subsidy removal. At the same time, 37 gigaton is also not insignificant. It's equivalent to the entire emissions from all sources globally at present, or the emissions from the aviation sector over the same period, or equivalent to the emissions from burning all oil reserves, all proven oil reserves in the United States, in Norway. As I said, we used system dynamics. It's a model created by Andrea Bassi that is the basis for our research. I will not go into too much detail here, but hopefully this is a useful footprint for some other researchers to use in their work as well. So how does the model work? We have tried to be inclusive of both first order and second order impacts. And this is really where a lot of the discussion happens. Because with first order impacts, it's pretty straightforward. Once subsidies are removed, the production costs go up, and that results in higher commodity prices, and as a result, less consumption and less emissions. But there is a catch, because once this happens, there is also a response from the demand side, and it effectively works in the opposite direction. So there is a pull on emissions from the subsidy removal, but there is also push from market forces. However, the pull is stronger than the push from market forces, and on balance we get this drop in emissions because some of the consumption still switches to energy efficiency, switches to renewable energy, and we can reasonably say there are savings globally. Of course, if this happens at a national level, situation can be different because, for instance, if country A removes production subsidies, the same companies can go and extract oil and gas and coal in country B. As Greg said, it's only one of the measures around the supply side mitigation policies. And there are two main takeaways. One is that we need better data, better subsidies estimates for the inputs. And secondly, that while this policy, production subsidy removal, is only part of the puzzle, it's not in competition with any other measures, and it can be used usefully to support other mitigation measures. For instance, in campaigns on oil moratorium, on coal moratoriums in different countries, campaigners successfully use subsidy estimates because it's, first of all, just bad use of public money with considerable co-benefits for the climate. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Ivieta. That was a fantastic and concise presentation of the report. I was wondering, actually, if maybe you could post the URL in the chat box so that people can get hold of the report itself.
Definitely, I will do. Thank you.
So let's move on to Pete Erickson from the Stockholm Environment Institute to talk about his modeling of subsidies in the US.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm trying to put my video on. I'm not sure I can figure out how to do that. Ah, there it is. Okay. Hi, and thanks for being here, everyone. I'm going to talk about a study that we recently completed on the US. So it's a much more narrow set of oil fields, a more focused study than what Iveta presented, but it has a similar aim, which is to really understand to what effect production subsidies impact the decision to invest in new oil infrastructure and therefore on the oil that ends up being produced. The motivation, well, one of the motivations for the study is that the US government itself, about a year ago, as part of the G20 process, and as facilitated actually by the OECD and Ron, who's going to speak later, that the US took part in this peer review of its fossil fuel subsidies, in which it identified over a dozen subsidies to fossil fuel producers. And we wanted to understand what is the effect of those subsidies on the oil investment and oil production. So there's been quite a debate in the US over the last few years as President Obama and presidents before him really looked to reform the subsidies almost yearly. And though Congress didn't go forward with those efforts, there was lots of debate. And really where the debate centered was, at least from a research perspective, was do these subsidies mostly go to profit and therefore not affecting the decision to invest? Or as industry was saying, no, they don't. They go mostly to drive new investment and the effects that happen from that. So we combined a number of aspects that are unique into our study and sort of create, in some ways, what's one of the most detailed looks at this question. So we looked at a field by field level. We looked at 800, more than 800 oil fields in the US. We took an investor perspective. In other words, for each of those 800, we looked at detailed cash flow analysis and how the subsidies would affect different parts of that cash flow up front or later on during operation and production. We looked at all those subsidies that I highlighted in yellow on the first page, meaning the major tax subsidies from the federal government, but also a number of other support measures that exist, whether related to liability or provided by two states in particular that we did a focus on, North Dakota and Texas. So just to give a little bit more sense of this cash flow perspective, I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with it, but here's kind of a hypothetical life cycle of an oil well where these light blue capital costs that go downward are high in the early few years as the wells are drilled and the various facilities are put in place. And then sort of peaking after that is the revenue from production. And so each of these cost streams and revenue streams can be affected by different tax or other subsidies. And so for each of the specific fields, we could adjust these based on the tax code, for example, or based on other ways that the subsidies affect that cash flow. So we used field by field level data that we purchased from Rystad Energy. We then, as I said, modified the cash flow streams for each and looked field by field. My colleague Adrian Down, who's I think on the phone, did a lot of this work. And so for each field, we determined which subsidies are eligible. Many in the US apply, especially for independent producers, for example. And we used a 10% hurdle rate, meaning that if the IRR, the internal rate of return, was less than that, we assumed the field would not go forward. If more than that, we assumed that it would. This is a fairly common hurdle rate used in the industry. We also ran some sensitivity cases that I won't have time to get into. We looked at about a dozen subsidies in total, and we did a deeper focus in a few basins that I mentioned. So let's get to some of the results here. And I put two panels up, one from the Permian Basin in Texas, another from the Williston Basin in North Dakota. And each of the little blue dots down at the bottom is a single field that has been discovered but is not yet developed. And so the blue dots are the economics of that field without subsidies in place. The gray dot or the orange dot immediately above it is the economics of the field with the subsidies in place. And so what you see over on the left of both charts is there's a number of fields that are already going forward, would already go forward even without the subsidies. And then the subsidies bump their returns by, in many cases over 10 percentage points in IRR or more. So that is a partial answer to the question of, do subsidies go to profit? Well, yes, for these fields on the far left, they go just to profit. The fields would proceed anyway. But for these fields that are the little orange dots, those fields got pushed over that hurdle rate just because of the subsidies. And so that's where the oil production and ultimately the CO2 effect would come from, because the subsidies led to more oil production and therefore more CO2 emissions than would otherwise occur. So on a national basis, just adding it up, of the 43 billion barrels of oil that we looked at, almost half, 45%, were dependent on subsidies to proceed. If once that oil is burned, it would be about 8 gigatons of carbon dioxide, and would be somewhat less depending on your market assumptions once you account for that increased production elsewhere or that consumption effect. Lots of details around that I won't get into, and need to move on because of time here. But so the central case that we looked at was at $50 a barrel. That's the charts I just showed, but we ran a number of sensitivity cases, anywhere from $30 up to $100 a barrel. And the effect diminishes at higher prices. You can see this orange part, that's the subsidy dependent part, tailing off at higher prices. That's because more fields are economic anyway at higher prices. That makes an intuitive sense, but it helps to understand that when we're at prices around current levels, $50 or $60 a barrel, that's where the greatest effect is. We also looked, not only for each field, but in aggregate at which subsidies had the biggest effect. The immediate expensing of intangible drilling costs is what is IDC here. That's what had by far the largest effect in our analysis. That's a federal tax subsidy. So in concluding, what we found are that lots of tax expenditures and other subsidy value, about half overall, goes to projects that would have happened anyway. At the same time, though, and this is really the new finding from this study, that the rest of the value, at least at $50 a barrel, goes to making projects proceed that wouldn't happen anyways, and that has a CO2 effect in terms of contributing to the carbon budget. And so the question, that this raises, I think, is, does this change or does this expand the case for subsidy reform? Not only does most of the value go to profit, even at $50 a barrel, but subsidies do affect production and ultimately emissions as well. So here's the paper reference for your interest and my contact information. Again, this paper had many other folks that contributed to it. They're listed here. My colleague Michael Lazarus and Adrian Down among them, as well as Doug Koplow of EarthTrack, a longtime subsidy expert who helped us identify and quantify the individual subsidies. So thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much, Pete. I wonder if, like with Ivieta, you could put a URL into the chat box so that people can easily download the paper to read afterwards. But before we go on to our third presentation, I just want to correct something I said earlier, which is that if anyone has questions they would like to feed into the discussion or the specific presenters to clarify, there's also a button at the bottom called Q&A. I'd mentioned the chat, but if you could type any questions you have in that Q&A button, that would be great. And please do just feel free to type them whenever they come to you, and we will handle them later. So I'd like to hand over to another country-specific study of subsidies for coal in Turkey, and Sevil Adja.
Hi, everyone. So I hope you can hear me properly. So this is a joint work with Professor Erinç Yeldan from Istanbul, from Bilkent University, and it's on environmental impacts of coal subsidies in Turkey. To start with the motivation behind this study, the motivation behind this study was to provide an analytical quest for Turkey to study the current role, and further costs of the existing coal subsidization scheme, and to assess the regional adjustments of phasing out coal subsidies in a dualistic economy characterized by fiscal and external constraints and labor market rigidities. For this aim, we develop an applied general equilibrium model and utilize both macro and micro level data to assess the impact of the current arsenal of coal subsidy policies in Turkey. So Turkey is rapidly increasing its demand for electricity and primary energy sources. On a per capita basis, the consumption of electricity has grown from 300 kilowatt hours in 2005 to 400 kilowatt hours in 2010, and it has further increased until now. And official figures project continued increase in energy demand, with installed capacity expected to grow from 64 gigawatts in 2014 to around 120 gigawatts in 2023. And the strategic direction has been only focusing on the expansion of coal-fired power generation using domestic resources so far. Here you can see the GDP growth rate of Turkey in comparison to the greenhouse gas emissions growth, and you can easily notice a decoupling of the the lack of decoupling of the emissions from GDP growth. And these emissions mainly stem from the energy sector, followed by industrial processes, agricultural sector, and household waste. In 2015, we had conducted another study for quantifying the coal subsidies in Turkey, and they had totaled up to $730 million only to the coal sector in the form of subsidies in 2013. And quantifiable subsidies to the coal sector as such corresponded to only 0.1% of total GDP, considering that the coal sector is not a big sector in Turkey. This was a huge subsidy and incentive provided to the sector. Still, these numbers only include direct transfers from the Treasury, R&D expenditures to the coal sector, rehabilitation support, government support for exploration and coal-fired power stations, etc. But they underestimate the total subsidy amount since they exclude investment guarantees, regional incentive scheme measures, price guarantees and purchase guarantees, and other environmental impact assessment procedures, and so on. So what we did in the study was first to look at the business as usual path between 2015 to 2030 using a computable general equilibrium model. The model is solved sequentially up to 2030, and we assume a 4% growth rate of GDP during this period. If you look at the 2030 levels as a result of the business as usual path, it will amount up to 682 million tons for carbon dioxide emissions. That corresponds to 800 million tons, around 800 million tons for carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And now, or let's say very recently, it has reached around 460 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by the Turkish Statistical Institute. Two scenarios were analyzed in the study. The first one is to eliminate the subsidies on coal production, which corresponds to 0.1% of total GDP. Second scenario adds to the first scenario the elimination of regional investment subsidies on coal, because regional coal investments are subsidized indirectly by reduced income taxes and corporate taxes at a rate of 30% in the high-income region, 35% in the low-income region. So we imply these two scenarios. And coming to the results now. As a result of the first scenario, coal production falls by 29% in both high-income and low-income regions. Aggregate GDP falls by only 0.2%. Carbon dioxide emissions are reduced by 2.5% over the base path by 2030. Among them, emissions from coal combustion fall by 4.2 million tons in low-income regions and 13.4 million tons in high-income regions. 3.4 million tons reduction of energy-related emissions of households is also reached. These numbers imply that carbon dioxide emissions from energy per dollar GDP falls to around 0.398 kilos under the scenario from a higher level of the base path. The second scenario reveals a GDP loss by 2030 of about 0.5%, which is quite negligible again. But the reduction in carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reached to 5.4%. Among them, emissions from coal combustion fall by around 42.6% in low-income regions and 42.7% in high-income regions. Total abatement of energy-related emissions reached to around 42.5 million tons, and again, ratio of carbon dioxide from energy to GDP falls to 0.382 kilos per ton. Now, you will see the results graphically of these two scenarios. The blue one is the base path, the red one is the scenario 1, and the dotted one is scenario 2, which adds the elimination of both the production subsidies and investment subsidies for coal. And you will see for total emissions from coal burning for energy, energy-related emissions, and energy per GDP. In conclusion, the elimination of all these subsidies to coal results in a very slight reduction of GDP, but a considerable decrease in carbon dioxide equivalent emissions in both high and low-income regions. Currently, while Turkey has ambitious plans for deployment of renewable energy, these are compromised by the maintenance of subsidies to coal-fired power generation and coal mining. Elimination of these subsidies and earmarking these funds towards other greener options will likely result in efficiency gains and environmental abatement. Thanks for listening to me, and you can find the paper in the Journal of Energy Policy as I shared in the first slide. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sefil. And I think what's really come out clearly from all three of those presentations is the concept of zombie energy, energy that would not economically be extracted if it weren't for subsidies, and which with the help of those subsidies therefore is extracted and has an impact on climate change. And it's great to see all three of those quantifications. We're going to move on now to look at where is the debate on removal of fossil fuel subsidies now? Where is the policy debate in particular? And we're very lucky to have Ronald Steenblik here to talk us through that. I'm going to share Ron's presentation, so just tell me when you'd like me to move on to the next slide.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm just
Okay.
sharing now.
Well, while you're doing that, hello to Lorcan Leons. I see he's listening in. So thank you. Yes, I was asked to talk about policy options, and I apologize that I don't have a lot of concrete ones here, but more to set the scene of what's involved. So next slide. So click. I wanted to first anyway underscore that actually efforts to reform subsidies have been going on for a long time. And in the case of coal, you had a lot of high-cost coal in Europe after the Second World War, and in Germany. And when oil prices came down, that lack of competitiveness started to be exposed, and over time we saw a lot of coal mining capacity in Europe totally eliminated in countries like Austria, Belgium, France, Ireland, Italy, etc. Some remains, but largely unsubsidized in the UK, and it was also eliminated in the eastern part of Canada. Next click. So, and what we have besides some mining in Central Europe is Germany, which is also per ton is heavily subsidized, but it is now committed to closing its last subsidized hard coal mines by December 2018, if not sooner. Now, click, sorry. I mean, people should understand that these subsidy reforms were often precipitated large-scale labor unrest. Anybody who lived in the UK in the 1980s, you would have witnessed that, or required considerable expenditure to retrain and deploy redundant workers. That's more the German model, where they've had a long phase out and concerted efforts to redeploy people who would otherwise be made redundant. Next click. Now, you may ask, were there some climate benefits? There were, but it was maybe some that were less well understood. And in fact, I wrote a paper back in 1995 on this, that the effect of these subsidies was largely actually keeping the domestic price of coal very high. And you would think that would be good, but in order to maintain that high price, you actually had to have all kinds of interventions in the market to force domestic utilities to use that high-cost coal, which meant that a lot of utilities kept on coal mining, coal-fired power plants that were inefficient, old, just to be able to make sure that they used whatever was produced domestically. Next slide. So a lot of people have been asking about various types of approaches that might be taken to what in the trade world is called disciplining subsidies. And of course, the first place one might look is formal law, and that's by that we usually mean the World Trade Organization. I have from time to time heard people say, "Oh, but the WTO doesn't cover fossil fuels." It certainly does. All goods are covered by the WTO rules. Next click. But as far as I understand, there've not been any disputes brought to the WTO or to its predecessor, the GATT, against a country's fossil fuel production subsidies. There may have been a few cases of countries applying countervailing duties on fossil fuels. These are where a country says our domestic industry is being harmed by imports of subsidized product, and so we're going to have a very targeted import tariff on product from that particular country. Click. But of course, never say never. It's not unthinkable that a WTO member could bring a dispute of another country's production subsidies to the WTO in the future. Click. But most of the support provided to fossil fuel production by national governments, particularly for hydrocarbons, less so for coal, has been in the form of tax preferences, which are difficult to challenge if they can't be shown to be de facto export subsidies. If you look at the jurisprudence of the WTO, almost all of the disputes over tax measures have been alleging that they were de facto export subsidies. Next click. But in recent years, particularly since the G20 commitment, various people have said, well, couldn't we have a standalone agreement on fossil fuel subsidies at the WTO? The WTO members, it is a member-driven organization, have been concentrating during most of that time on trying to see what they could get out of the Doha round, which started in 2000 and was kicked off in November 2001. And now there's a new work program, and some countries such as New Zealand have called for some discussion on this, but we're still in very early stages. Next slide. So that brings us to what some lawyers call informal law, and that's which involves more cooperation and without any hard disciplines. And the G20 and APEC, among other groups, are probably best known for that. Most of you are probably aware of the G20 leaders' statement at the 2009 Pittsburgh summit, and that spoke of rationalizing and phasing out of the medium-term inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption. Note the key phrase here, that encourage wasteful consumption. Next click. The APEC leaders in November 2009 followed just a couple of months afterwards. Their commitment has similar language, and note it also refers to that encourage wasteful consumption. Click. So initially, the common interpretation of these statements was that they explicitly left out subsidies, however defined, and neither organization has actually come out with their own definition, benefiting fossil fuel production. But, click, we have seen that some members have been willing to declare their intention to phase out government support to fossil fuel production. This was shown in particular in the G20 peer reviews of China and the United States, where both of the countries proposed some measures related to, in fact, tax-related measures for phasing out. In the U.S. case, it depends on Congress, and so I'll let you draw your conclusions there. Next slide. But it's also notable, that the G7 leaders at their summit last May in Isushima, Japan, committed to the elimination of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, without including the phrase that encourage wasteful consumption, and actually set a concrete date. So what next? That some countries are proposing to phase out production subsidies creates a precedent, a helpful precedent, and opens space for new conversations. But these need to take place at the domestic and international levels. Click. At the domestic level, obviously, there's a big role for civil society organizations. And one thing I think that they need to remind the governments is that, especially ones that tax their domestic fuel use heavily, that their untaxed exports are still going to end up being burned somewhere and will also add to carbon emissions. Next. And at the international level, I just would echo what several people have already said about the need for better data, and so that we can make more complete international comparisons. We're doing our part. We produced the first set of production subsidy support numbers published in 2010. We continue to update that, not only at the national level, but subnational level. But of course, the research community and can also help in digging into that and doing the kind of analyses that we've just seen. Click, next slide. Thank you, and the next slide just shows what our online database looks like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron. And thank you to the people who've already asked questions. You've probably noticed that that there are two tabs in the questions. One is for typed text answers. In particular, the presentations and the video of this will appear on the GSI website. And I'd like to encourage all the panelists to watch out for specific questions that could be answered by text. So I think there's a couple there that Ivieta could probably type answers to, such as on the why electricity subsidies were excluded. What we're going to do now is we're going to hear very briefly from three other people who are on the call with us. I'm going to ask each of them to keep their comments very short, to just a couple of minutes. And then we will come back to the questions in the Q&A box and going back to the panelists with those. So first I'd like to invite IPEC Genç-Su, who's a senior research officer at the Overseas Development Institute. IPEC. I wonder if we might have lost IPEC. Maybe we could move on to, we'll come back to IPEC if we retrieve her, but let's move on to Mark Fulton. Mark is the founder of Energy Transition Advisors and an advisor to the Carbon Tracker Initiative. And Mark, I just wanted to highlight to you the first of the questions in the box, which asked, is there a study that looks into the cost of stranded assets which produce fossil fuels and how that will affect subsidies? So if you'd like to include that in your comments, please feel free to. Thanks. Mark, we can't hear you yet. You need to unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, is that better? Sorry, missed that one.
Got it.
So basically, I just want to take you back a little bit to 2015 on a study that was done by Carbon Tracker, my group, EarthTrack, Doug Koplow, and Tim Buckley at IEFA. And that was looking at probably an early study at the thermal coal production subsidies in the PRB in America and Australia. This is the summary for the policy makers. And back then we were just doing a simple you know, first round effect, not general equilibrium, not dynamic modeling. But I think to uncover some of the big forces that take place in these models that you've heard about, which are much more sophisticated. But however sophisticated they have to deal with some of these rather difficult economic things that are also quite simple in a sense. But the first thing we did, though, is to look at the different types of subsidies. And I'm going to look more at the Powder River Basin in the US. We looked at the ongoing subsidies. We looked at what subsidies that were phasing down, so we could look at the dynamics of that, rehabilitation and self-bonding, and the coal lease subsidies. So I think, you know, as we'll see from the SEI, you know, from the other studies, you've got to look at the composition of some of these studies and some of these subsidies. And again, we did something similar for Australia. One thing we left that we couldn't do very well, and we think it's very important, and we talk about it in the paper, is the effect of the first round infrastructure subsidies. In a sense, you know, infrastructure can be a yes, no switch here. So take Australia at the moment. If they don't provide $1 billion for the rail costs to go into the Galilee Basin, will any of it actually happen? Very good question. So it's an interesting area to look at, I think, for the future, is infrastructure costs, rail, port, and so on. They're very important things. So anyway, what we're able to do is to get a total set of costs per ton. You can see about $7.50 for the PRB. Sorry to do this to you. Then what we did is we did our cost curve analysis. So we basically said, you know, instead, you've seen the previous work doing it field by field, but we just said, look, let's do an economic analysis here. Let's shift the supply curve by the costs, and then let's come up with this heroic demand curve. So shifting the supply curve, it's not too controversial. You can see that happening there. But the demand, what shape has the demand curve got? And that is critical to the elasticity of demand. So I have to say, whatever the general equilibrium models are, and however, you know, sort of interesting it might be to see complex relationships, the elasticity of demand dominates this stuff in terms of a simple supply and demand and impact. So, you know, what we did is sensitivity analysis. So you could say an elasticity of demand of 0.5% or 0.5 times, you know, is probably short run, and it can be lower. A lot of the literature, we went into a lot of literature on this, is down at 0.1, 0.2 in the short run. So you don't actually get a lot of effect if you shift the supply curve and the costs. But over time, you'd expect that to rise. And we felt, you know, look, as I said, there's pages and pages on this, but we felt that an elasticity of demand of 1 to 1.5, maybe as high as 2, could be possible in the longer run. And therefore, we just, on the supply-demand interaction, you can see the impact, you know, at half, the total impact is 8% drop in output. Then you've got 16% at 1 times and 22% at 1.5. Now, in the case of Australia, although the numbers are much lower anyway, you'd expect the elasticity of demand to be very high if Australia takes off its subsidies in the global seaborne market. We've got so many competitors. We believe that the United States is more like a coal island. We're going to see a lot of debate as to whether the PRB gets substituted against other coal areas. But generally, because the US can't export so much at the moment, then we found that, you know, that this is more trustworthy. So what we then did is we had a look. Yep.
So sorry, Mark, could I ask you to wrap up? We're really running out of time here.
So we had a look at some of that impact in terms of CO2, but that depends on running your models to do that.
Thank you, Mark, and sorry to cut you short, but what I'd suggest is, I'm sure a lot of people would like to dig into that work you've done, and maybe you could paste the URL in the chat box there so that people can look at that paper and get into the numbers and think more about the elasticity issues. I'm going to hand over to IPEC now. Please be as brief as you can so that we get onto the questions.
Great, I will. And I have to be because I've had some patchy internet, so if I drop out, you can just move on. So I'm joining on behalf of ODI today, and apologies from Sheila Whitley, who one of the co-authors, she was unable to join. But I actually wanted to share a sort of very different angle, which is a recent development. And so, you know, it's not really the research side, but more about what's happening in the world that is galvanizing this agenda on fossil fuel elimination. And that is that on Tuesday this week, investors and insurers with 2.8 trillion in assets under management publicly called on the G20 to phase out fossil fuel subsidies by 2020. And this was ahead of the G20 foreign ministers meeting taking place today and tomorrow in Bonn. So I wanted to sort of raise the issue that this agenda, all this great research that is being produced by the partners, is starting to make an impact, and investors and insurers, which are a critical voice and a rapidly growing constituency in recent years, are really starting to speak out. This effort was coordinated by ODI and Oil Change International, and in their statement, the insurers and investors really picked on some key points which are also highlighted in the Zombie Energy report, as well as the work of the colleagues. So they really pushed for the German G20 communique this year to include language on having a clear timeline to phase out subsidies by 2020, prioritizing subsidies for exploration and coal production, again, reflecting some of the points that Sevil raised. They set a clear timeline for, they argue to set a clear timeline to phase out domestic and international public finance for oil, coal and gas production by 2020, and also for the G20 members to complete peer reviews by the end of 2018. So again, this echoes some of the key points that was raised in the Zombie report, and also suggests that countries draw on the OECD inventory to move beyond just the OECD countries, and there is increased transparency by ensuring other countries are also disclosing their subsidies. The ODI press release on this development referred to the report findings. So from their perspective, obviously they highlight the increase in risk of stranded assets, the decrease of competitiveness in key industries, and also the fact that there's all this effort that's going on carbon pricing, and the continued provision of subsidies is negating a lot of that effort. And again, as it came across in Eric's presentation and Sevil's presentation, they reiterate clearly that, you know, these are notoriously inefficient from an economic standpoint. They finally, just to conclude, they emphasize that this builds on the commitments in the G20 from China's communique last year in terms of allowing the financial system to mobilize capital in the right direction, building competitiveness, and achieving the Paris Agreement and low carbon transition. And finally, they also pushed the task force on climate-related financial disclosure to also move forward with their recommendations to include for companies to consider the impact of fossil fuel subsidies on their operations, and what their likely removal will mean for their operations. Again, you know, will it make companies continue to be profitable? Is obviously a question discussed today. So I think that's a really fantastic commitment from these investors and insurers, and I think there are others who are on the fence, who are not quite ready to publicly come out yet, but there are obviously more sort of inside track conversations going on. And I think it's really encouraging to see them to publicly to support this agenda as well.
Thank you ever so much, IPEC, also for giving us some more insight on where the debates are now, and how we're getting towards implementing removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Our final short intervention is from Radek Stepanski, who is a lecturer at the University of St Andrews. Again, I'd ask you to keep it to just a couple of minutes, please.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for giving me the opportunity to chat here. And I really just wanted to make 2 points that sort of I've been thinking about myself. The first one is on general equilibrium effects, and the second one is on net subsidies. So in terms of general equilibrium effects, many of these types of models that try and estimate the size of fossil fuel subsidies really take as an input some sort of international price of energy. However, if we start to think about the price of energy as an international measure that is determined, by the actions of individual countries working together, then the removal of fossil fuel subsidies will actually influence this price as well. And that can potentially have some very different short and long run effects. So in the short run, if anything, the general equilibrium effects will, create an even greater benefit of removal of subsidies, because removing subsidies to firms will basically have an impact on the supply curve and an impact on the world energy prices. Prices should go up, which would limit the supply of energy to the world, and hence potentially lead to lower emissions as people consume less of this more expensive energy. So in the short run, that's great news. In the longer run, things start becoming a little bit more hazy, because we start getting this potential technology adoption. So for example, you could think of a world where prices of energy are higher due to the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. You can think that the incentives in that world for asset owners and firm owners will be much greater when it comes to investing in new technologies, that will make expensive fields cheaper to use. So potentially in the longer run, the removal of subsidies might encourage new technologies that will actually make fields that were previously not economically viable suddenly economically viable in the future. So the question really becomes, are these sort of zombie assets, or are they maybe sort of sleeping beauty type assets, just waiting to be awoken and used in the future? So in particular, in other words, should we be thinking about the impact of these subsidies only in the very short run, or also in the long run, as it sort of encourages us to potentially use that energy in the future? So that's sort of the first thing to talk about. The other thing that's sort of very interesting, it's fantastic that we're getting this data on consumption and production subsidies, but what's really sort of important, I think, to carbon emissions is net subsidies, right? An overall view of how all government interventions within an economy work. Because we can easily think of examples where if you have, consumers being subsidized by 10% and producers being subsidized by 10%, the net effect on consumption and emissions will be zero. So in some sense, it is important to get a view of of how countries subsidize economy overall, rather perhaps, or in addition to understanding how consumers and producers are subsidized. So if I can maybe just finally plug a little bit my own research, I have some work where I calculate net subsidies for individual countries using indirectly the energy consumption of economies. So that could be a helpful sort of contributor to the consumption and production subsidies that are now out there as well. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you very much, Radek. And just for the last 7 or 8 minutes of this webinar, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go back to our 4 original panelists, and I'd like them to sum up. I'd like them to deal with any outstanding questions or anything that they'd like to comment on. I'm very grateful for everyone who's typed answers in the comments. I think 3 that stand out for me that look like they could still use some comments. The first is on the cost of stranded assets. Secondly, fossil fuel support from export credit agencies. And thirdly, subsidies geared towards efficiency of fossil fuel use and extraction. And I'd like people in their summing up to think about where are we now with the concept of zombie energy, and what comes next? How does this feed into the debates? And I need you to be quite brief. You've got about a minute and a half each, and we'll do it in the same order in which people presented. So if we could start with Ibieta, please.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the questions. They were excellent. And taking the opportunity, I also want to thank Greg for the excellent moderation. With zombie energy as a concept, I think there is enough evidence now to say that subsidies to production do influence the price and therefore influence consumption. And it means that for the G20 commitment and APEC commitment, that has this qualifier, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption, there is a need also to look at the production side. There is a link between the two. We need more data. We need better understanding to support some of the assumptions and the modeling, and I think Radek has also covered it quite well, because there is difference between short-term first-order effects and long-term second-order effects. And I'm really looking forward to more research coming on this topic, but not only research, but also the discussion on these topics within G20, within APEC, and within UNFCCC, and possibly within other forums. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivieta. Pete?
Gladly. Well, thanks for this great discussion, and glad to be a part of it. I'd like to riff a little bit on the oil price question that Radek raised, because I think it's a really important one. I think certainly Iveta's analysis and ours found that you know, at higher oil prices, $80 a barrel and up, say, the effect of subsidies on production and therefore on emissions is less. And you know, if we're in a world where prices come, you know, rapidly bounce back and keep rising, then I think Radek's point is really good, that what subsidies do is basically bring up production in time, and also, you know, removing subsidies would therefore create these sleeping, I'm not sure I would say beauties, but push the production back a little bit in time. And so from that perspective, okay, maybe removing subsidies buys us time to enact better climate policy rather than having as much of an effect on its own. But there's another way to look at it too, which is that in a low carbon transition, what would the oil price be? There's not enough research about that, but what I've seen suggests that we may, and this is from IEA and others, that prices may stay at $50, $60 a barrel. And it's just in that world where our study found that the subsidies to producers have the biggest effect, and in which case it may not be a case of just moving production in time, but actually having a substantial effect on extraction and ability to meet our climate goals. Subsidies may be contributing to carbon lock-in in a way that makes those goals more difficult to reach.
Thank you, Pete. Sevil, your concluding comments?
Yes, thanks again for initiating this efficient webinar. I'm very happy to be part of it. First of all, what I will focus on in this speech is that there is a contradiction of policies in most of the countries that continue about the subsidies on fossil fuels and the subsidies on renewable energy. So in Turkey as well, they continue all together. And first of all, maybe the governments could be warned about that, especially by these reports and further scientific studies that show the impacts of subsidizing both types of energy. And second, many people have asked, or several people have asked me about the impacts of using these revenues from the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies or coal subsidies. I haven't done that yet, but it's on my further future research agenda. I'm almost sure that there will be positive impacts on both the macroeconomy side and the environmental sectors. So I'm sure there will be even better results for the after the earmarking of the fossil fuel funds for greener options. So that's how I will conclude. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Sevil. And finally, Ron, your closing thoughts?
Yes, rather than sum up what I said before, I'd like to come back also to this question of short-term versus long-term. It makes a difference about what kind of production we're talking about. I mean, what we've seen is that a lot of countries, even if they're trying to reduce their own consumption of fossil fuels, if they have development of hydrocarbons, particularly offshore hydrocarbons, once that infrastructure is in place, they want to basically get that developed, because you don't abandon all that infrastructure that's going to rust, et cetera, and then come back to it several years later. And similar with coal. If you look at the countries where they close down coal mines, I mean, once you no longer have that coal labor, once the coal seams have flooded and whatever, you generally don't go back to that. So I agree with the general point, but in many cases, the specific situations, if you're talking about a marginal kind of production that really is dependent on subsidies, and the effect of phasing them out means that you're going to stop work there, it could have a very long-term effect.
And I think that's really a perfect point on which to end this webinar. We've seen very clear evidence here today of how fossil fuel production subsidies do have a measurable effect on climate change. And I'd like to thank everyone who joined in. We had about 65 people here, which shows that this is an issue whose time is now. Thank you everyone for the richness of the questions and the comments. Thank you to our 3 interveners, and in particular, thank you to our 4 presenters for a wonderful webinar and a really stimulating discussion.